Hey folks, and welcome to ShamanTalk. My name is Rhonda and I'm your host. And this week we're going to talk about worthiness. Whether you think you're enough, why you might not think you're enough, and how we can start to explore this topic in order to overcome the self-limiting belief, the block that creates for us. So a question I hear a lot is, how do I even step onto the spiritual path fully, the spiritual path that I'm really drawn to, when my beliefs are stopping me from committing to it? So how do I even fully step onto the spiritual path that I'm drawn to when my beliefs are stopping me from committing to it? Well, one of the ways that you can start to figure out why you can't fully commit to a spiritual path is to kind of lighten the load and start to dismantle some of the beliefs that are holding you back from getting started in the first place, or if you've been started in the past and you stalled. So things like, I'll never know enough, I don't have what it takes, I'm scared to fail, I don't trust myself, I'm not worthy of a more spiritually connected or happy life. So those excuses might sound familiar. What's interesting though is that back in the day, before I kind of found my spiritual path, if you'd read those out to me, I probably wouldn't have resonated with any of them. And yet they're all true. So when you're really in the space of being lost and being run by your self-limiting beliefs, it can actually be really hard to see them. But really, all of the excuses that we have, that we make up in our mind, the excuses, let's call them the self-limiting beliefs, we can boil it all down to one thing, to the same feeling, and that is, I'll never be good enough. Okay, so let's break that down, because I hear that a lot. I hear people say a lot, oh, I'll never be good enough, I don't think I'm good enough. But what does that mean? To me, that's like an empty statement. It doesn't mean anything. How do you even begin to work with that? What does good enough mean to you? Good enough to you will mean something different than it means to me, and will mean something different than it means to somebody else. Who are you comparing yourself to? Good enough compared to what? So really, if you think about it, good enough is an imaginary line that you've drawn in the sand of your own mind. So you've decided what good enough means. So what does it mean for you? Knowing the most, being the best, being fearless, being perfect, being an enlightened being who floats through life in a state of spiritual bliss. What does good enough mean for you? And if good enough means anything on that list, then you will never feel good enough, because nobody is perfect. And I guess we get stuck in that space, not because we don't feel good enough actually, but because we're stuck because good enough is an impossible standard that you've set for yourself. It's not your fault. We live in a world where we're bombarded with images of greatness on TV and social media, and anything less than perfect is an unacceptable goal. But when the goal is perfection, knowing the most, being the best, being fearless, being perfect, being enlightened, then fear of failure really sets in, because deep down, you know that you'll never be perfect. And that's okay, by the way. Nobody's perfect. So we need to learn how to drop the impossible standards, because they're not serving us. As a human being on this earth, you are already good enough for this work. You're already good enough to step onto this path. And if we need a standard to measure ourselves by, then let's make it this. Let's make it trying our best every day, no matter what. Let's make it trying our best every day, even if our best isn't that great. Let's make it trying our best every day, putting one foot in front of the other, even if we fail, even if we're scared. Especially if we're scared, facing fear. And that's where greatness comes from, guys. It's just doing it anyway, regardless of the excuses, regardless of the voice in our head, regardless of what our inner self-limiting beliefs are telling us. Do it anyway.
So now I'm going to talk about why we sometimes feel inadequate, why we feel not good enough. I'm going to go through some examples of the types of things that can cause that, so that it might help you to pinpoint some of the past issues that might be causing these self-limiting beliefs. Because what is really interesting is that you can know cognitively till the cows come home what your self-limiting belief is. You can know that you don't feel good enough. Yeah, you can know that. I mean, I think many of us do. You can know that you self-sabotage. You can know that you have blocks and resistance. But knowing doesn't seem to mean healing, does it? Knowing in your front mind doesn't seem to fix the problem, really. So one of the first things that I always do with clients is talk to them and find out what's been going on in their life and try and put together a picture of the story of how we've gotten to the place that we're in and why we are where we are, so that then we can start to pinpoint the areas that need work with guides and with potentially with a practitioner. So let's go into some of these. So not being good enough essentially is low self-worth. And low self-worth often stems from some really deep-rooted issues. So I'm just going to give you some reasons. So number one, you have hidden core beliefs that are running the show, and I just touched on that, and I was just talking about this very thing. So the thoughts we actually hear in our heads are far less powerful than those lurking in our subconscious. Low self-worth is inevitably connected to the buried and hidden assumptions about the world, others, and ourselves that we mistake as fact. These core beliefs are usually formed as children, with a child's very simple perspective, and they can be really surprisingly dramatic and completely untrue, and yet we unwillingly base all of our life decisions around these core beliefs. For example, a child with a parent who suddenly leaves one day without offering reason is not evolved to understand an adult having a mental breakdown or running off for space after a fight. In the child's mind, the core belief becomes, if you love someone, they leave you. That takes hold. Even if the parent comes back a few days later, that belief sticks, and the child grows into an adult who never lets anybody close. So another reason for not feeling good enough is if you listen deeply, your inner voice might actually be really critical and judgmental. Now, I hear a lot of people who come across, I've worked with hundreds of people this year in my clinic, in one-to-ones, and thousands in my healing circles and workshops and whatnot. And it's very easy to convince ourselves that we're positive thinkers. Get a lot of people who tell me, yeah, I'm great, I'm good, I think really positively, I've got a really good outlook on life. And what I find is when I dig a little bit deeper, many people don't actually take the time to properly listen to their thoughts. Because if they did do that, they might discover a quiet radio show of negativity. So one of the ways that you can work with that is to journey with your guides and ask to meet your inner voice. That can be a really good way to start to listen. I know a lot of people like mindfulness techniques as well for observing your thoughts. Mindfulness doesn't work for me because my mind is too busy. It probably works now, but in the beginning when I first started this work, it simply didn't work. But if mindfulness works for you, by all means, give that a try. That will slow you down enough to hear your thoughts clearly. And you can get mindfulness guides anywhere, just Google it. But this is a shamanic show, so we'll talk more about the shamanic side of things. So go with your guides, ask your guides for support to meet your inner voice and see where it's at, and ask for honest feedback about the way that you speak to yourself. And that can be a really good way to figure out how critical and judgmental your inner voice actually is. Number 3, sometimes we surround ourselves with critical people. Some of us don't need our own negative thoughts to ensure that we don't feel good enough. We let other people do the job for us, by unconsciously choosing toxic friendships and unhealthy relationships where others put us down, no matter how hard we try. And I think we've all had relationships like that. And it's that kind of subconscious self-limiting belief that we're not worthy for anything better. So keep your eye on your relationships and how people speak to you. And maybe start to think about boundaries. There are podcasts on that very subject. I love talking about boundaries. I've not mentioned the word for a while, I don't think. But, start to think about saying no. Perhaps number 4, you had critical, demanding or aloof parents. I call it that emotionally unavailable parents. So one thing I would say is that so many clients come to me and say my childhood was fine. I had a good childhood, I lived in a nice house, my parents never divorced, I never wanted for anything. But then again, we dig a little deeper, again, we scratch the surface, and perhaps we did want for some things emotionally. Perhaps we wanted the approval and love that every child needs that we didn't get. Maybe your parents always wanted you to be smarter or quieter or sportier, or they favoured a sibling. Whatever it was, the message was that you are not enough as you are. It might well be that your parents or parent was not good at loving themselves due to their own unresolved issues, and that kind of caused problems in their parenting style. We're never parent bashing here. We're never saying that it's anybody's fault. We're not attributing blame. All we're saying is that trauma is passed down, and that I hear many people say that their childhoods were great, but that meant they had great clothes and nice shoes and a nice house, but they were missing emotional connection and attachment. Perhaps the one parent was working away all the time, and often you'll find that one parent had anger issues that left the child feeling quite unsafe. And I'm not talking about physical, I'm talking about mental. You never feel quite okay to say things or be the way that you want to be. You're always a little bit scared of a parent. Or, for example, the devouring mother archetype, where the mother puts all of her energy, focus and will into raising her children to the detriment of herself, and that teaches you to put your own needs second, and that often that children of mothers like that end up spending a lot of their time trying to meet the emotional needs of their mother, and that can cause low self-worth issues as well. Okay, so as children we naturally seek approval and love, so we learn to suffocate our real personality and become the good child at the price of turning into an adult who never feels a sense of self-worth. So number 5, your main caregiver couldn't offer you stability or safety. So some children have a parent who's simply unable to offer them an environment of safety where they can trust their parent to be there for them. Perhaps your parent was an alcoholic, suffered depression, or was in a toxic relationship that demanded all their attention. So if a parent is unwell, a child can feel responsible for the parent's happiness. If you only acted a certain way, did certain things, were somehow a better or smarter child, then your parent would be okay. But of course, a child can't fix a situation like that. So their endless codependency evolves into a belief that they're not good enough. They weren't able to help their parent, they weren't able to make their parent better, so therefore they're inherently not good enough. 6, you didn't get attachment as a child, when both these points about parenting involve is not having a caregiver who was able to offer unconditional love and trust, and it's called attachment in psychology. So attachment theory believes that for the first 7 years of life, a child absolutely needs unconditional love and to be able to trust his or her primary caregiver. If this doesn't happen, we can end up with anxious attachment, and attachment theory is fascinating, I love it. But it basically involves never trusting yourself or others and lacking in confidence. So if there was attachment issues. Some of those are quite similar, but all very relevant. Number 7, you experienced strong trauma in the past. A trigger warning here for, I will be mentioning abuse in this section. Of course, one way to develop negative core beliefs quickly as a child does not necessarily involve poor parenting. Childhood trauma decimates a child's sense of worth. Most children feel responsible for their trauma, especially if it's physical abuse or sexual abuse, and they internalise that idea that they're bad and worthless, and so they deserve the trauma that happened to them, the abuse that happened to them. So, is not feeling good enough always about the past? It's inevitable that the environments and experiences of our childhood affect us. But there are other factors as well. Some of us were actually born naturally more sensitive than others. So until they find a way to work with their sensitivity and build a toolkit of resilience, then these types of people tend to suffer more. And I would say that that's definitely a personality type that I come across in my clinic, is people who are just super sensitive. Often they'll call themselves empaths. And they'll have other issues such as saviour issues, where they just have to rush in and save people all the time. There'll be lots of different things that they do. And a lot of the podcasts that I've done are designed to support people who are particularly sensitive. Particularly sensitive people also usually have wonderful psychic gifts, but really struggle to use them effectively and safely for themselves because they don't have boundaries. They don't know how to be resilient in their own energy levels and make sure that they kind of look after themselves. So it's not always about the past. Sometimes it's about your personality. Sometimes it's a marked trauma as an adult that leaves us not feeling good enough, such as a betrayal. Even then though, we'll find our confidence and self-worth suffers more, and we take longer to recuperate if we had the previous trauma in our early life or we experience poor parenting. And what I would also say is, generally speaking, people who are lucky enough, and there are not many of us, I have to say. I was a poor parent myself. You can listen to the podcast with me and my daughter to hear some of the struggles that we had. And again, there's no blame here, but there's so much trauma in our culture that it's very hard to find effective parents. And many of us have suffered at the hands of ancestral trauma, passed down. And it really does affect these core beliefs. So let's go back to the beginning. So those are some of the reasons why we suffer from these core beliefs. And it's one of the reasons that we set ourselves up for failure, because we have this inherent belief that nothing should work for us. We are not good enough to receive any of the things that we need to receive. And therefore we've decided that good enough means something that we can never attain. Knowing the most, being the best, being fearless, being perfect, being enlightened. We make good enough an impossible standard, and we seek perfection when actually perfection doesn't exist. So in the next section, I'm going to give you a couple of exercises to do to start to help you to make more sense of where this feeling of not good enough comes from for you, and a way to kind of start to work with it. If you have a core belief that you're not good enough, it's an ongoing process to unpick that. It's not going to happen overnight. And just when and I have this core belief as well, and just when you think that you've done the work and that you've cracked it, something else comes up. And just when you think that you're there, something happens and it switches you straight back to childhood, straight back to not good enough. And it's really interesting for myself to watch my own project with this work and watch the highs and lows and the peaks and troughs. And it's hard and it's difficult, but there are highs as well where you're like, wow, I've done it, I feel amazing, I'm doing really well for myself, I feel like doing really well in my business. I love doing my podcasts, I love being able to create content for people that they find useful and helpful in their life. You know, I'm working towards my legacy in this lifetime, but that feeling still comes back sometimes, and you've just got to learn how to be resilient and know that that's what's happening, and work with it kindly and compassionately and a little bit at a time, step by step by step. And it does change and it does get easier. So go ahead and get a pen and paper, and I'll see you in part 2 in just a sec. Okay, so activities and journeys for this week. These are all in the show notes at centreforshamanism.com/63. So you don't have to necessarily write them down if you don't want to, they'll be in the show notes. But you can also write notes if you want to. So what I'd like you to do, first of all, is I'd like you to journey with your guides and ask to meet your inner voice. Now I mentioned this in part 1. What does your inner voice look like? What does it sound like? What do you think needs to change here? So do the journey and ask to meet your inner voice, and then come back and ask yourself those questions. What does it look like? What does it sound like? What do you think needs to change? And then if you wanted to follow that journey up by asking your guides how you do that, that's also a really good thing to do as well. How do I change this inner voice? What steps can I take to make these changes for myself? And those journeys will really help you to understand your inner voice much more clearly, so that you can begin to make changes to your inner narrative, to these self-limiting beliefs, these subconscious beliefs that are hidden drivers of your behaviour. Okay, so number 2 is a really simple way to work with these types of neural pathway changes that we are looking at. And we want to begin to turn our negative thoughts into positive mantras. So for example, if you find yourself being critical of your inability to speak up for yourself, think of a mantra for that. So in this case, I have a right to speak up and be heard. It would be an excellent mantra to have. And a mantra is something that you say over and over again for at least 60 seconds, as many times a day as you can remember. And over time, these positive affirmations will change the neural pathways in your brain, and you'll naturally begin to think differently. Now, sometimes I hear people poo-pooing mantras as just silly and ineffective. But I can honestly say that mantras are one of the simplest and quickest ways to start to change inner voices, change inner narratives, and change self-limiting beliefs. So don't be too quick to dismiss this as a project. If you've never tried mantras before, please do give it a try. Really throw yourself into it and see if it works for you. If mantras is something you've worked with before, go back to it. You know, we can always work with new mantras. I work with mantras all the time. I really love, I love that. I love the work. Love the opportunity to do that. Right, so that's your activities and journeys for this week. As always, I'd love to hear from you in the Facebook group. The link for the Facebook group is in the show notes at centreforshamanism.com/63. It's a wonderful group, and everybody who comments in there has always got really insightful, lovely, thoughtful things to say, and I'm really grateful to everybody who takes the time to do that. It's really lovely. It's a really lovely community. So I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. I hope it made you think about what being good enough means to you, who you're comparing yourself to, that good enough is just an imaginary line that you've drawn in the sand, and that you'll never be good enough if you try and reach perfection. Nobody's perfect. We need to change the way that we think about that. All right? So have a great week, and I'll see you all, same time, same place, next week. Hey, thank you so much for listening. We love it. We love you. We love connecting with you on our podcast. We're really pushing our Facebook community right now. It is where all the juicy shamanic stuff happens. So if you'd like to join us in that community, you'll find us on Facebook and look for the Centre for Shamanism community group. And we'll see you there.